Okay, so looking at different types of reproduction. So we've touched on meiosis quite a bit, so that's a component of this. Um, but with asexual reproduction, what VCAR wants you to do is to compare asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction. So looking at the advantages and disadvantages of, meiosis and forming, having two gametes come together, as opposed to not requiring basically another organism to reproduce. So we've talked about binary fission. We looked at that diagram. So you just replicate the chromosome and you cut the cell in half. That's binary fission. So a very quick process. Budding is kind of what we see here often in Hydra, for example. So we can see that it's literally, as the name sounds, they just start to grow this little bud and eventually it grows and becomes an entirely separate organism. Vegetative propagation is literally like when you're gardening and when you plant something. So, you can take a stem or a root off another plant and put it in soil and it'll grow. This idea of vegetative propagation as a form of asexual reproduction. So these cells are able to basically grow on their own. And then spore formation, which is what we're kind of seeing here. So you've got your plant and then your spores are basically released in the air and they travel throughout the air and then they can land somewhere else, often in a moist environment and then grow from there. So all of these examples involve asexual reproduction. So they come just from one organism itself. What that means, though, is that there's none of what we've talked about before in terms of the genetic variation. So you don't have this additional sort of source of genes or source of alleles as you do in sexual reproduction. And that's a really big consequence or a really big negative of asexual reproduction, is that they are ultimately clones of each other. So like this little Hydra, this is genetically identical to this. And so that's not the best thing because of this idea, if there's no genetic diversity, the species can ultimately be wiped out. And we'll talk about that when we get to biodiversity. But that's the idea there. That's a really big negative, is this idea that you have less genetic diversity. A big positive of asexual reproduction is this idea that you can replicate quite quickly. So with binary fission, for example, if, I don't know, let's say that the bacteria is running low on numbers or any other organism that uses binary fission, the idea is that they can replicate really, really quickly to get a large amount of offspring or of other organisms in a really short amount of time, compared to sexual reproduction, which often takes a little bit longer. So that's the idea there. Okay, so with reproductive cloning, so you ultimately create a clone, as the name suggests. So you can kind of think of it as like, it's like sexual reproduction, but you don't need the fertilization. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. So you've got your somatic body. So this could be a cell from anywhere. So let's say I wanted to clone myself. So I would take a somatic cell. So let's say maybe I took it from my arm, my stomach, wherever. So I take this body cell and it's got obviously all my genetic information in the nucleus. So I take my nucleus out of this cell. Let's say it's from my skin. I take a skin cell. I take my nucleus out and that's got all my DNA in it. At the same time, I take this egg cell. So it could be my egg cell, could be anyone else's egg cell. So we take this ovum and we remove the nucleus. So we remove the foreign, genetic information from the other person or the other organism. So now we've just got basically an empty ovum. And we then put my nucleus that came from my skin cell into this ovum, remembering that the ovum is able to kind of generate and grow rapidly. So we put my nucleus into that egg and the egg does, what the egg should do. It just grows. It makes a lot more cells because it recognizes that we've got 46 chromosomes in here. So let's get growing, and that's what it does. And ultimately it grows into another organism. And then I clone myself. Obviously that hasn't really come to life yet, but I think with animals it's a little bit more common. Has been done before. So like Dolly the sheep, is a big thing because it was the first animal to be cloned, I believe. So that's exactly what they did. So they got Dolly's mum. They got Dolly's mum's nucleus. They got an egg cell from this random sheep. They put Dolly's mum's, Dolly's mum's, Dolly's mum's nucleus into this egg cell, and they then inserted this egg cell into another sheep, and then that sheep gave birth to Dolly. So hopefully that makes sense, and that's the idea here of reproductive cloning. So we take this cell, and so hope it makes sense what I was saying at the start in terms of it's like sexual reproduction but without the actual fertilization. So you've ultimately gotten, instead of getting 23 chromosomes from one, 23 chromosomes from the other, putting them together and then letting it grow, you just get 46 chromosomes from one, put it in the ovum, and then put the ovum in the surrogate, and then that egg continues to grow. And then you've got a clone because obviously there's no genetic variation. So hopefully that makes sense. Then Dolly the sheep was a clone of the other sheep. There are obviously negatives associated with this, lots of ethical things, as you can imagine. So that's probably a really important question that might come up. With the new bio study design, so basically bio got a new study design in 2022. So you guys are the second year 1-2 cohort to be using this study design. A big change in that study design was a lot more emphasis on bioethics. So going into 3-4 next year, you can expect to see a lot more bioethics questions. So this is a really good example of a spot to discuss bioethics. So I'm sure your teachers might bring it up when discussing this. But you want to be thinking about things in terms of ethics, ethics of cloning, of removing this egg, things like that. And you can think about it in different categories. So kind of like moral ethics, or perhaps, economically, consequences of that, the health of the actual clone, the health of the surrogate. Because on that note, I think with Dolly the sheep, their idea of cloning is that I think you talk about telomeres in 1-2. So telomeres are like little caps on the end of your chromosomes, and they basically give the chromosomes an age, if that makes sense. So they, like, the older you are, I want to say shorter your telomeres are, either shorter or longer, but that's the idea. They're like a mark of age, basically. So when you get a somatic cell, so let's say, I get a somatic cell from myself, I make, I take it out and I make a clone of myself, right? So I have it in a surrogate. Obviously it starts as a baby. But the idea is that the telomeres in the genetic, in my genes, in my DNA that we've now used in this clone are short because I'm older, right? So then when you put it in this baby, or let's say like Dolly the sheep was obviously, a lamb. The idea is that her telomeres are shorter. So I think she died pretty soon after, I want to say. So that's the idea there. Like, there's a lot to kind of think about and consider. It's not really just like, you can just take this and chuck it in and then have a clone. Okay, so in terms of therapeutic cloning, this is obviously different to reproductive cloning. Reproductive, you're thinking about reproducing an organism, as in like giving rise to something else. Whereas therapeutic cloning is when you're more so just looking for the actual cells. So you have this clone ultimately, and then you can use these cells for tissue culture. So for example, you might use stem cells or things like that when, perhaps like in leukemia or in different other contexts with diseases, when you require other tissues or tissue regeneration, something like that. You can think about that as cloning, because you're using this genetic information to make other cells, perhaps to replace cells that have been depleted somewhere else. So reproductive cloning and therapeutic cloning are two different things, so don't get them confused. All right, so we've talked about some advantages and disadvantages already. So if we think about it in plants, it might be a little bit more ethical than in animals. But you can see things like increasing yield, disease resistance, because obviously you can just get a plant that's really good, that's got all these perfect traits. You just take their genetic information and you clone them, and you can do this a billion times, and now you've got this amazing, crop of really great, strong plants. So you can see that a lot of these advantages are very helpful, again, in the context of plants. Disadvantages. So a really big thing, like what we've talked about with asexual reproduction, is lack of genetic diversity. So again, things can be wiped out. So if you've got, this amazing crop, this amazing field of, plants that are genetically identical, they're great, but they're genetically identical. If a disease comes through, if one's susceptible, all of them are susceptible because they're genetically identical. So that's something to really be aware of. And this idea of deleting alleles from the gene pool. So, you've got other alleles such as poor yield, maybe late fruiting, I don't know, disease susceptibility. Obviously, they're not alleles that you want, but the idea of completely eradicating them from the gene pool is, again, a disadvantage, because that idea of genetic diversity and just creating things that are really genetically similar is not advantageous in the long term, ultimately.